Somewhere in a windowless government warehouse, stacked floor to ceiling on steel shelving that groaned under the weight, sat crates of food that were packed during the Second World War and simply forgotten. Not lost, not destroyed. Forgotten in the most bureaucratic way imaginable by a government that had ordered so much of it that nobody could keep track. You are looking at one of the strangest logistical accidents in American military history, and it starts with a simple question nobody in Washington wanted to answer in the summer of 1945. What do you do with millions of meals when the war that needed them is suddenly, abruptly, over? The official story says these rations were sealed away and left untouched for decades, a monument to wartime excess quietly rotting in the dark. But that is not what happened. What actually happened is stranger, more human, and in some ways more unsettling, because those sealed cans did not stay sealed. They followed American soldiers into Korea. They followed American soldiers into Vietnam. And decades later, ordinary people would open them on camera, breathe in air that had been trapped since 1944, and taste a war that had technically ended before their parents were born. Before you decide the ration depot was some kind of forgotten tomb, you need to understand how it got that full in the first place, and just how long the government kept quietly reaching back into it. To understand why so much food ended up buried in warehouses, you have to go back to a research kitchen at the Chicago Quartermaster Depot in the early 1940s, where a physiologist named Ansel Keys was handed one of the strangest assignments of the war. The army needed something an airborne soldier could carry into combat, something small enough to fit in a jacket pocket, calorie-dense enough to sustain a man through a parachute drop and a firefight, and durable enough to survive weeks without refrigeration. Keys built what became known as the K-Ration, a compact box of tinned meat, biscuits, a chocolate bar formulated specifically not to melt, and enough powdered extras to make a man feel like he had eaten a real meal when he had not. It was never meant to be a soldier's only food for long. It was meant to be a bridge, a stopgap between real meals, something used for days at a time, not months. But war has a way of turning stopgaps into staples, and by the time American forces were fighting across 2 oceans simultaneously, the Quartermaster Corps was not producing K-rations by the 1,000 or even the million. It was producing them by the tens of millions, alongside an entire alphabet of other rations, C rations, D rations, 5-in-1 rations built to feed 5 men from a single crate, all pouring out of factories at a pace that assumed the war would keep needing them indefinitely. Nobody was planning for the war to stop. They were planning for it to escalate. And that assumption is exactly what set the trap. Then, within the span of about 4 months in 1945, everything the Quartermaster Corps had been preparing for simply vanished. Germany surrendered in May. Japan surrendered in August. Factories that had been running around the clock to produce emergency combat rations for an invasion of the Japanese home islands, an invasion that planners expected to cost hundreds of thousands of casualties, suddenly had no invasion to feed. Quartermaster records tell you exactly how catastrophic the overcorrection had been. In 1943, the Army had ordered 0D rations, the dense emergency chocolate bar meant purely for survival situations, because there were already so many sitting in storage that procurement made no sense. Then in 1944, with an invasion of Japan looming on paper, that number jumped to roughly 52 million units. 52 million emergency bars ordered for a battle that never came. By 1945, Quartermaster officials were not asking how to make more rations. They were asking, with real anxiety in their internal correspondence, how in the world to get rid of the ones they already had. Millions of soldiers were coming home at once, demobilizing faster than any army in history had ever demobilized, and every one of them stopped needing a combat ration the moment they stepped off the troop transport. Warehouses that had been built to move product out as fast as it moved in were suddenly choked, stacked wall to wall with food nobody in uniform needed anymore. The problem was not that America had run out of rations. The problem was that America could not stop making them fast enough, and now there was simply too much of everything, sitting in the dark, waiting for someone to decide its fate. That decision fell to men who had never planned for peace, and their choices were far messier than a simple order to seal it all away and forget it. Some officials pushed to dump the surplus outright, the same instinct that led American forces in the Pacific to bulldoze entire depots of jeeps, generators, and equipment straight into the ocean at places like Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides, creating what locals still call $1 Million Point, a spot where you can now scuba dive through rusting trucks rather than pay to ship them home. But food was different from hardware. You could not simply shove crates of edible rations into the sea while returning soldiers and starving Allied civilians were reading about it in the newspapers. Others in the Quartermaster Corps argued for the opposite extreme, mass distribution, shipping the surplus overseas to feed populations in occupied Germany and Japan, where food shortages were becoming a genuine humanitarian crisis as local agriculture and infrastructure lay in ruins. Some of that surplus did go exactly there. 5-in-1 rations, originally designed to feed small combat units in the field, were repurposed and distributed through civilian feeding programs in occupied territory, quietly solving one crisis by unloading another. But that only accounted for a fraction of what existed. The rest presented a colder, more practical calculation. Officials looked at rising Cold War tensions, at a Soviet Union that had just become the second nuclear power on Earth, and at a Congress that had no appetite for funding a full peacetime rebuild of America's emergency food reserves from scratch if another war broke out. So a quieter decision took hold, one that never made headlines because it was not a single announcement but a slow accumulation of policy. Keep it. Store it. Do not throw away a stockpile you might desperately need again within a decade. Nobody wanted to be the officer who ordered the emergency rations destroyed only to watch American troops go hungry in the next war. And that decision is exactly what turned ordinary quartermaster warehouses into something closer to time capsules. What actually happened inside those depots over the following years is where the real story lives, and it is far stranger than a warehouse simply sitting sealed and untouched. Facilities like the depot in Jeffersonville, Indiana, which had produced over $2 billion in wartime materiel and stayed fully operational straight through the Korean War, became long-term custodians of a stockpile that refused to disappear. And here is the detail that upends the entire premise of a sealed, forgotten depot. That surplus did not just sit there, it got used. When the Korean War broke out in 1950, barely 5 years after Japan's surrender, the Quartermaster Corps did not have time to fully retool ration production from scratch, so troops shipping out to Korea were issued combat rations that had, in some documented cases, been packed years earlier, still bearing manufacturing dates from the closing years of the Second World War. And the surplus kept following American soldiers even further than that. Veterans of the Vietnam War have described, in their own recollections, being issued C rations and K rations in the field during the mid-1960s that were unmistakably World War II stock, tins with faded labels, some completely peeled away by decades of humidity and handling, so that opening one became a genuine gamble on what you would find inside. Soldiers called it exactly that, a lucky dip, because by the time you cracked the tin open, there was no telling whether you had drawn ham and eggs or a fruit bar that had been sealed since before you were born. And remarkably, most of it was still edible. The preservation technology built into those cans in 1943 and 1944 had worked so well that food packed for a war against Japan was still nutritionally intact for a war being fought in the jungles of Southeast Asia 2 decades later. Think about that for a moment. A ration designed to survive a few weeks in a paratrooper's pocket ended up surviving 20 years in a warehouse and coming out the other side still safe to eat. That is not a forgotten depot. That is one of the most quietly effective food preservation experiments in American military history, running continuously and completely by accident. And the surplus did not stop resurfacing once Vietnam ended either, because the leftover stockpile was so enormous that pockets of it kept turning up for decades afterward, long after anyone in uniform actually wanted to eat them. By the 1980s and 1990s, collectors and militaria enthusiasts had discovered that surplus stores across the country, and even in occupied Germany through joint agencies distributing captured Wehrmacht material alongside American surplus, still had unopened cases of World War II-era rations sitting in back rooms, sold not as food anymore, but as history you could hold in your hand. And then came the internet, and with it an entirely unexpected second life for those sealed cans. A wave of YouTube ration reviewers, the most famous going by the name Steve1989, began tracking down decades-old military rations, from World War II K-Rations to Vietnam-era C rations, and opening them on camera for audiences who wanted to know exactly what history tasted like. He has cracked open unopened tins of chocolate that were packed during the war, describing the smell as rancid, the biscuits inside crumbling after 70-plus years of sitting untouched. These videos have racked up millions of views, and on auction sites, a single sealed World War II ration tin, the exact kind that sat forgotten in a depot for years before someone finally cracked the seal, now sells anywhere from $5 to over $100, depending on how intact the box remains. So the sealed rations in that depot were never actually a monument to something abandoned. They were a slow-motion relay race, packed in 1944, reissued in 1950, carried into Vietnam in the 1960s, sold as surplus curiosities in the 1980s, and finally, decades later, opened on camera for millions of strangers who wanted one bite of a war none of them had lived through. The deeper you dig into this story, the more you realize how many quiet threads connect a wartime kitchen laboratory to a modern internet phenomenon. Ansel Keys, the man who designed the K-Ration in that Chicago research lab, went on to become one of the most influential nutrition scientists of the 20th century, later developing the landmark research that shaped how doctors understand dietary fat and heart disease, a legacy that started with trying to keep paratroopers fed for 72 hours at a time. The 5-in-1 ration format he helped popularize did not disappear with the war either. Its basic specification was revived in 1948 for an entirely new generation of field rations, meaning the shape of American combat food for the next several decades traces directly back to boxes that were originally overproduced and left rotting in warehouses. Even the modern meal, ready to eat, the MRE carried by American troops today, exists as the direct descendant of a supply chain problem that began with 52 million unwanted chocolate bars in 1945. And there is something almost poetic about the fact that the very same depot system, the Jeffersonville Quartermaster complex that once stored millions of these rations, no longer exists as a military facility at all. It closed in 1958, and today its red brick buildings house a farmer's market, small businesses, and a public park where people walk their dogs across ground that once held enough emergency food to feed an invasion force that never landed. The mountains of surplus are gone. What is left behind is quieter, but the story embedded in that quiet is one of the most overlooked chapters of the post-war transition. A reminder that winning a war does not end its logistics. It just changes what the logistics are for. So the next time you hear someone describe a warehouse full of World War II rations as something sealed away and forgotten, remember what actually happened. Those cans crossed 2 more wars before anyone finally let them rest. They fed soldiers who were not even born when the tins were packed. They ended up on eBay, in YouTube videos, in the hands of collectors who wanted to taste 1944 firsthand. Nothing about that story is a dusty secret sitting untouched in the dark. It is a food supply that simply refused to stop working, decades after the government that made it assumed it would already be gone. What does it say about a nation that it kept quietly relying on the leftovers of one war to fight the next? That is the question worth sitting with. If this kind of hidden military history is exactly what you come here for, make sure you are subscribed, because the next depot we open holds a story even stranger than this one, and the doors are already unlocked.